A warm welcome to all of you here at the E-Werk. My name is Amira El Ahl and I'm looking forward to hosting the upcoming discussion. Just for your information, this panel will be held in English, so if you need a translation into German, you can get headphones here at the entrance and then everything will be translated simultaneously. Also für diejenigen, die eine Übersetzung gerne hätten, das Panel wird auf Englisch stattfinden. Sie können sich eine deutsche Übersetzung hier vorne holen und dann wird alles simultan übersetzt. We want to delve in the next hour into the changing dynamics of international relations, particularly in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As countries reassess their trust in one another, this panel aims to explore the implications of this shift on global politics and the roles of international actors such as the Goethe-Institut. Let me introduce to you our guests today on the panel. Next to me is Claire Yorke. She's an author and academic specializing in empathy and emotions in international affairs, diplomacy, leadership, and politics. She currently leads an EU-funded Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship, I hope I said it right, on empathy and international security at the University of Southern Denmark. She came with the train all the way from Denmark, yes. She was a Henry A. Kissinger postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at Yale University after receiving her PhD from the Center of War Studies at King's College, London, and she began her career working at Chatham House and the Houses of Parliament. We're very happy you're here with us today. Hello. A warm welcome. Oh, yes, please. Go ahead. A warm welcome to Marija Golubeva. You probably saw her yesterday at the opening. She is a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, researching the ways to innovate EU support for the new candidate countries, Ukraine and Moldova. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, and from 2018 to 22, she was a member of the Latvian Parliament and chair of the European Affairs Committee. Between 2021 and 22, she was the Minister of Interior and responsible for Home Affairs and Migration Policy, developing and implementing Latvia's response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis following the outbreak of the Russian aggression to Ukraine. A warm welcome. I'm very happy that you came all the way from Taiwan. Now, I tried to pronounce it once properly. Hsuan Wu. Wow. Also known as TT Cat, and I'm allowed to call you that way. He's the co-founder and CEO of Double Think Lab, a Taiwan-based organization that operates at the intersection of the internet, public discourse, civil society, and democratic governance. Double Think Lab is researching modern threats to democracy and devising strategies to counter them. He is focused on mapping China's online information operation mechanisms and facilitating the global CSO network to combat digital authoritarianism. Warm welcome. And last but definitely not least, a warm welcome to Johannes Ebert. He's been Secretary General of the Goethe-Institut since 2012. Prior to that, he was director at the Goethe-Institut in Kiev, Cairo, and Moscow. In addition to fostering European cooperation and integration, his work focuses on increased engagement in crisis regions and countries undergoing upheavals, such as Ukraine, North Africa, and the Middle East. He's also been president of the EU National Institutes for Culture since June 2022. A warm welcome. Now let's dive into the discussion and the changing dynamics on international relations. Marija Golubeva, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has ushered in a new era in international relations in which parameters of cross-cultural trust are undergoing a readjustment. As a historian and a former minister of the Interior of Latvia, how do you assess the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on trust in international relations, and in particular among European countries?
Well, paradoxically, it has done a huge damage to trust in international relations globally, and at the same time, I believe that in Europe it has forged a new kind of unity, which is basically impossible without trust. So it was a kind of litmus test. We saw that in Europe, after all, and in the West in general, we after all trusted each other enough to mount a very, very complicated effort to help a country defend itself, a country which is not even part of EU or NATO, to defend itself from very rapacious land grab and imperial policy which completely ignores international law. So we are, of course, living in the age of interdependence, and we have to all the time deal with relationships that require trust but do not always produce trust as a result. So I think we are at a certain crossroads here, and I hope that the way we reacted in the West is showing that basically we have chosen the right way at this crossroads.
But despite this new unity, as you call it, Central European countries such as Latvia, Poland, the Czech Republic have long, or in the past, long warned others against Putin or trusting in Putin and depending on Russian energy. And you've done that for years. And these warnings have long been ignored, especially in Germany, but also in other Western countries. What do you think are the reasons for this ignorance? And do you, I mean, did you do damage to the mutual trust, or do you think that you overcame this, as you just said, with the new
Well, as we live, as I said before, in an interconnected, interdependent world, we do not have the luxury of spending centuries restoring trust. If we have allies, we have to be able to trust them even after hiccups or even prolonged misunderstandings. That's point one. Point two, I think it's very important that we all have lived in hopes that the global order is going to be more peaceful, more constructive, and that interdependence will generate more peace, not war. As Mark Leonard writes in his book, The Age of Unpeace, it actually produced the opposite effect very often. But it doesn't mean that we have to completely give up on cross-border trust, and especially on trust among allies, because then we don't get anywhere.
Ms. Yorke, I mean, you're specialized in empathy and trust. What role do they play in international relations, and how could they be used more wisely, maybe, to prevent conflict in the future also, such as the one in the Ukraine?
Yes, so I argue that empathy and trust are central to international relations, and especially to diplomacy. Diplomacy is about going out into the world and trying to understand different people, different cultures, how they think. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with them or that you condone their actions, but this capacity and this attempt to try to understand how many different people see the world, and this has been a recurring theme throughout the panels so far, is critical to really building both trust, but also understanding to make better decisions, and also to understand potential sources of conflict before they arise. And obviously right now, as Marija said, it's this paradox of there's a lot of tests to the capacity for empathy and tests to that trust, but also this idea that there is a potential within this crisis for change and to move towards greater understanding of how there are different experiences of the world that we can then incorporate into finding better solutions. In more local voices, that bring in a far more global and universal perspective of the kind of environment, the kind of climate and international environment we're trying to create is, I think, really critical right now.
Can you maybe name a concrete example where in the past there was a situation where maybe in international relations more trust or more empathy could have made a difference and yeah, maybe prevented a conflict?
I mean, I think one of the interesting accounts is when we look, for example, at how the war in Iraq was handled. If we truly, I say we, I'm a British citizen living in Denmark. If Britain and America had more fully understood the dynamics on the ground and understood the way in which power was dispersed and the ways in which different people held power in a way that was not necessarily as we understood it in Britain or in the United States, you could have got a very different form of engagement. And if you understood as well the consequences of an intervention, how might that have been different? And it's really interesting with the 10-year anniversary just passed, seeing how much lessons learning is being talked about. How much could we have done differently? What could have been changed? How could we have related differently to people on the ground? That's really coming up. And I think had that been at the heart of strategy, had that been at the heart of decision-making at the start, how might the conflict, how might the way of dealing with that policy towards the region have been different?
Yeah, and then probably the course of history would have been different. That's very interesting. Mr. Ebert, Before becoming Secretary General, you headed the Goethe-Institut in Kiev and also in Moscow for several years. So you know both countries quite well, also from personal experience. How did you perceive the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what consequences did it have for the activities of the Goethe-Institut in both countries?
I mean, of course, this was a very big shock for us, and I immediately called some Ukrainian friends. And we had a very big institute in Kiev with 120 people working there, and most of them left in the first weeks. There are now 50 people are back again. What we did, we continued working without any break. Digitally, with the support of the foreign ministry, we made some programs to support the cultural scene in Europe and in Ukraine, and also did some language offers for refugees who came to Germany. So we had a wide range of programs financed by additional money from the government. And I think these were very useful programs, and I think we really have to continue them. The other difficult decision we had to make was what do we do with our institutes in Russia? Because we have 3 institutes in Russia, in Moscow, in Novosibirsk, and in St. Petersburg. And of course, there was internal pressure on us to close these institutes down, and also some people outside said, "Aren't you part of the sanctions?" But we decided to let them open. And maybe this is something we also can discuss controversially here, but we think that staying in Russia, as one partner put it, keeps the Iron Curtain 5 centimeters above ground. So we say that culture is, and this is about empathy, and it's about people-to-people relations. So we decided to stay in Russia. We are still there. It's not easy, but we stopped every cooperation with state actors, but we work with civil society, which is still there. A lot of them left. We also work with them in the neighboring countries. We still have language courses because we think that young people who learn our language still have a little bit of an open heart for working with Germany and Europe, so we decided that. But, for example, we have a regional system with one institute as a regional institute who controls the budget and everything. And this was in Moscow. And I remember very much we had a meeting of our employees, about 1,000 people taking part, and they said, "Why are we part?" The Ukrainians said, "Why are we still part of this region? Why is Moscow still our head institute?" And we really decided to stop this.
But I would like to have a question to that, because, I mean, how did this decision to stay open in Russia affect the trust of the staff in the Ukraine? I mean, did you have to manage that somehow?
Yes, of course. I'm standing there and saying, I think that culture is the way to stay in contact. And of course, I'm criticized, but this is what the Goethe-Institut has to stand for, in my opinion. And I think if you explain well, then people accept what you say. What I see more critical is this whole region, teacher training, working together culturally, making consortium in different levels. They worked very well together over the countries. And this trust was broken. This trust was deeply broken by Russia and by the Russian people not to speak up against it. This was also a big discussion in this meeting. And we had letters from our teachers in Ukraine. We don't want to work in teacher training with our colleagues from Russia anymore, with whom we worked for decades. And this is the real trust-breaking and deep thing that the Russian government really destroyed. And this is, I think, something maybe we can talk about later, which will take a long time to rebuild.
I would like to go into another world region, the tensions between the world powers, namely China and the US, are on the rise. Before I ask you, Titikat, I would like to know from Claire Yorke what measures could be taken to build up trust between the political leaders of the US and China, in order to minimize the risk of a potential political future conflict in the region?
Yes, I know they've recently met. There's just been the start of new dialogue, and I believe that by maintaining channels of dialogue, even if they're back channels of dialogue, because it may be politically difficult in public to have huge dialogue, that's a really critical way of finding interlocutors with whom you can share the most honest and frank accounts of what's really going on and the likelihood of conflict or of tension. And also that's a way of building up trust. And we see that with so many of the big negotiations that have transformed international relations. It's because there have been these relationships between key people on each side who've been able to translate what is going on in a way that is trusted and honest and frank and often very difficult. But I think that's one of the really important ways, is that they maintain a form of dialogue and acknowledge that there may be public anger and frustration, because that's part of the performance of politics and also the politics and the tensions involved. But a second one is exactly as Johannes mentioned, is to maintain certain forms of people-to-people connection. And it's often underrated in diplomacy. But when the conflict is often not among the people, but among the states and the leaders. And so by getting people to understand other countries beyond just what we hear in the media, beyond stereotypes and very reduced, reductive images, it then means that people are much more open to question what they hear and the stereotypes. And they have their own account and their own experience of what it really means to know someone from China, to know someone from America. And then that kind of helps in the longer term once you reach a point of agreement or reconciliation or a thaw in relations.
Titiket, what is your assessment of the current situation and the current escalation of Chinese political rhetoric, but also political action towards Taiwan, including the recent large-scale military operation just off the Taiwanese coast? I mean, do you think this, what Claire just said, is, you know, gonna?
Yes, I know lots of people are wondering that. We are also wondering that every day here in our office and with our civil society partners, what will come next, and you keep reassess the situation. But if I want to make like a very brief introduction about the situation, the threat for Chinese government to unify Taiwan by any means necessary that include using a military force, it has never been stopped for 70 years. So if you came to Taiwan, and I welcome everybody here to enjoy our city and the food, if you came to Taiwan right now, you found that people who live there having the normal life just like everybody else do. You couldn't see any like a panic or people are storing the supply or anything. Even during last year when after Pelosi visited Taiwan, there's a missile launched by China to the sea. People still like very chill because lots of people are. I would say lots of people do generally sense that it intensified over the situation, but I think if you ask people that whether or not they will invade in this year or next, the people generally don't believe they will do so. It's because they've been threatening that much for a very, very long time. People might get used to it, or people have a different thought about their actual motivation. And
so you don't think that there is a real threat that China might invade, like let's say in the next 5-10 years? And has maybe, I mean, in order to bring back the two streams of this discussion, has maybe the war that Russia is leading in the Ukraine and the Western support for Ukraine, you know, that Marija was talking about, changed maybe China's perspective on that, because they see there is support, there will be, you know, the West will be unified in order to help.
Honestly, I don't know. I can only share my feeling, right? So the most fear time was like last year when Russia started war. At the first 100 days, I was worried about if Russia is getting Ukraine so easy, and China might follow, and very, very soon, and they just want to strike during the chaos, or when everybody's attention in Europe. Yeah, that was the most. Sometimes I also wondered. Another question is troubling me is that you see China is increasing their threat not only to Taiwan, but also very publicly their wolf warrior diplomacy is very well known right now. But sometimes I wonder whether they are stupid, or they don't know, or they are intentionally. Especially when French ambassador from China went to the French television, national TV, and say they will re-educate Taiwanese once they unify to all the French audience. I don't know whether they are out of the intention, or they really honestly don't care or don't know what French people might like to hear. So this kind of like small signal is troubling us every day, and we are, yes, we can only prepare for whatever outcome or situation. Yeah.
I would like to interrupt our discussion here on the panel for a second, because we would like to show you here and you in the audience a video. In the preparation of this debate, the Goethe-Institut asked people all over the world about their thoughts on trust in international relations. We will see this short video now with their answers.
When you talk about international relations, you're obviously talking about governments and politics and all of that. Yeah, I think trust is the foundation of every relationship, so it's the same for international relationships.
In der Diplomatie ist es schwierig, mit anderen Partnerinnen überhaupt zu sprechen, wenn Vertrauen nicht da ist.
If you don't trust international organizations, they cannot function.
Hochwasser war ein schönes Beispiel, da haben wir sehr stark mit dem Pol zusammengearbeitet. Die hatten Wasser bei sich, wir hatten Wasser bei uns, und wir mussten miteinander das Problem klären.
Da kommen wahnsinnig viele Menschen, Kulturen, Charaktere, Geschichten zusammen, die alle irgendwie miteinander verbunden werden müssen für Verträge, für Abkommen. Und nur wenn wir quasi uns gegenseitig also auch darauf vertrauen, dass ein Land, ein Partner auch das einhält, können wir überhaupt arbeiten. Also ein schönes Beispiel wäre ja Völkerrecht, basiert im Endeffekt auf Vertrauen. Und wir sehen, dass das oft nicht funktioniert.
Ich denke, dass Vertrauen auf jeden Fall eine riesengroße Rolle spielt. Und das ist leider in den letzten Jahren in meinen Augen so, dass dieses Vertrauen bei den Weltmächten oder vermeintlichen Weltpotenzen nicht mehr da ist.
Ich denke, dass wir leider militärische Bündnisse brauchen, weil ich komme aus Estland, unser Nachbarland ist Russland. Russland hat letztes Jahr Ukraine angegriffen. Also ja, es ist einfach wichtig, leider.
I have a feeling that if Ukraine was a member of NATO, lots of terrible things we are experiencing now wouldn't happen.
Ukraine cannot defend itself from a huge country like Russia, who has more military power. So he needs to have allies.
Militärische Bündnis ist also wichtig, insbesondere in Taiwan. Taiwan ist so klein.
I would say that I don't agree with interventionist countries. That's my whole answer coming from Latin America.
Ich glaube, dass man Verteidigungsbündnisse braucht, auch für die Zukunft, um Konflikte beizulegen. Persönlich, und das ist aber jetzt meine ganz persönliche Meinung, wäre ich eine große Verfechterin der europäischen Armee, weil ich glaube, dass wir zwar aus der Erfahrung des Zweiten Weltkriegs lernen müssen, aber es geht nicht darum, sich aufzurüsten, sondern es geht darum, sich verteidigen zu können.
I don't think the world should have militaries, and thus they don't have to cooperate. I think human beings should talk to each other. The barrel of a gun in itself is ridiculous. You can't have conversations with guns in your hands.
Also ich glaube, es ist auch sehr wichtig, dass es auch kulturellen Austausch gibt. Klar, ich meine, Kulturinstitutionen haben immer andere Seiten. Klar, für das Land, das diese Institutionen hat, ist es auch sehr wichtig, die eigene Softpower zu verbreiten. Aber andererseits natürlich sind auch dazu einfach über Kultur sich auszutauschen, über Demokratie.
Ich würde sagen, dass kulturelle Institutionen eine extrem große Rolle spielen, um das Vertrauen in Staat und Menschen zu verstärken.
I think cultural organizations, they do a lot of, for example, performances, musical performances. That is really nice for people to understand each other. But I think there needs to be an exchange.
I think that the best way to trust other cultures is to get to know the people. It can be by traveling, by just talking to someone who lives in your country and comes from another country. Because when you talk to people with one individual, you can see that they are so trustworthy. It doesn't matter where they come from.
So there seems to be a lot of trust in cultural institutions to promote soft powers. It must make you very happy, Mr. Ebert. Yeah. But also diplomats.
Of course, it's true.
Yeah. But also diplomats like to claim that close relations and broad exchanges between countries can help to build mutual trust and prevent conflicts. But Russia seems to prove this wrong. I mean, preventive diplomacy, long-standing economic ties, broad scientific and cultural exchange, which you were and are a part of. None of this was able to prevent the attack on Russia, on the Ukraine, and the Russian aggression has triggered a new primacy in military worldwide. I mean, we also just heard that the military is on the rise. But what lessons can be learned from this for the work of international actors like the Goethe-Institut?
Firstly, thank you for the trust that we can solve any crisis, even the Russian one. No, we cannot. Yeah, but firstly, I was asked this in a lot of interviews during in the beginning of the Ukraine-Russian crisis. Did you fail? And I said, no, politics failed. We did not fail because our networks still are active and alive. We created, for example, not long ago, a Goethe-Institut in exile, where we worked with actors from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, from other countries who had to leave their country. But they have been in their countries, they have been our partners. So I think when situation is getting better, we will work with these networks again in these countries, and they play a big role from the exile to work with these countries. So in my opinion, we did not fail, but as long as our networks are still working, that we really build up a long time. And actually, the good thing for me about Kultursymposium Weimar is that I always have the opportunity to think a little bit about the topic and the question, how do institutions like the Goethe-Institut create trust? Yeah, I mean, we always say it, trust, it's our vision, we say it, für Vielfalt, Verständigung und Vertrauen, for diversity, understanding and trust. But what does that mean? How do we do that? And I think there are certain factors or parameters that we have to fulfill to create trust. The first is that we are a very long time in a country. This is, I think, very important. I remember our president, Carola Lenz, coming back from the 70th birthday of the Goethe-Institut Athene, and she said, so people told me they were still remembering the time in the dictatorship in Greece in the 60s and 70s, where the Goethe-Institut was a place where you could exchange freely your opinions. And this is the case for Lisbon. It's an institute which was founded 60 years ago. And I don't want to say in which countries we do this now, because it's always a little bit sensitive, but this is our history, and I think this is the role of these institutions. Second thing is we have to help in emergency situations. And of course, I said a little bit what we did for Ukraine, but we also did a Corona helping fund together with the Foreign Ministry and other actors to support civil society actors all over the world to continue to work. And I think this creates a sense of reliability, and this creates, on the other hand, trust. Then the third thing is active listening. Like Claire said, you don't go there and say, okay, we are good, we are from Germany, we do this and that, but you active listen what people want from you and what people ask from Germany or from a cultural institution, and how do you do things together. And then I read the book of Martin Hartmann, who was yesterday on the panel on trust, Vertrauen, and he said it's always going back to the relationship between two people, between two human beings. And if you take this serious, then it's not only about quality, but it's also about the quantity of people that we bring together. So, because that's my belief, maybe it's wrong, but because if more people have the chance to get into contact, understand what the opposite, what the other thinks, then you create an understanding which can lead to trust if it goes well. So right now we have to invest into these things, into scholarships, into cultural projects, into language learning, and so on, so that the most possible number of people has the opportunity, like in Kultursymposium, to get into contact, understand what the other thinks. Last point, it's topics. We have to discuss topics that relate to all sides, okay, climate, feminist things, and so on. But what was important for me in conflict zones, in language training, we brought together people, teachers from Azerbaijan, Armenia, and we brought them together in Georgia. And they were not discussing about their conflict, but they were discussing about how do we improve the language teaching in our classes. And these things, to go through topics which are not directly related to a conflict, but which are a common topic, and bring people together from different countries, even adversaries, this can be very interesting. Sorry for being so long.
Yeah. I would like to give a chance to Marija Golubeva to maybe react to something that one woman said in this video. She said you can't have conversations with guns in your hands, which is pretty true. But talking about Latvia, I mean, you share a pretty long border with Russia, and do you think there will be ever enough trust in the world, and especially in your country, to envision a world without military power, and especially in the scenario that we are in now, that people just talk without guns in their hands?
Well, I probably will not be able to answer the question about will there be ever, because of course we don't know about the world in 50 years, let alone in 100 years. I'd like to stick to the present and the nearest future, so to say. I think it's very important to understand that there are different levels. There is the level of practical survival, and at this level of practical survival, yes, at this point in time, we do need military alliances. It's not nice, but it's unfortunately the reality. So the Baltic states, including Latvia, are extremely grateful to our partners in NATO for being very firm in their position that they are ready to defend us, and we are, of course, ready to contribute to the alliance in that way. However, we need, of course, to look beyond that at wider issues like global trust. And there is an issue there that we can see from the results of very authoritative studies that people outside the West, so in the so-called global South, I know it's not a very good term, but we don't have a very clear universal term for that, do not trust the West's position on Ukraine, or at least they see the situation in Ukraine differently than we in the West see it. And that is, of course, a problem because, you know, we would like people to see why what Russia is doing in Ukraine is absolutely inadmissible and actually evil, because it's not just about territorial integrity and sovereignty, which is important enough, but it's also about human lives and livelihoods. However, it would be good if we could explain this to people from, say, India or Africa or anywhere where people currently say both sides are at fault, or where people say, well, it's NATO which provoked Russia into invading Ukraine. And what we have there is a result of a long distrust about the West's motives. And of course, sometimes we in the West have been, you know, doing things that do not invest this trust and do not produce trust. So from the point of view of our own conscience searching. We probably should be looking at cases where we have applied double standards, cases when we have not been emphatic enough to speak of empathy. So yes, I think there are two levels. There is one level where we have to broaden this global empathy and understanding, but there is also the practical level where currently we cannot do without military alliance.
There's a million questions I still have, but I would like to open the panel also to questions from the audience. If there are any, please raise your hand. I can barely see anything, but we have a microphone here that we will hand to you. So if you have any questions, please don't be shy. Let me know, otherwise I continue with my many questions. So far, no, but if you do, please let us know, and then we come back to you. So, Claire, you said before that empathy is necessary to get out of a conflict. We just heard it also from Marija. In the light of the Russian attack on Ukraine and Putin's apparent cold-bloodedness, I mean, he doesn't seem to have any intention to stop this war. Is a pledge for more empathy in international relations, or could it be perceived as naive, maybe, and out of touch with the real world? How would you respond to such criticism?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually would counter that by saying, I think it's naive to assume we can keep doing what we're doing without taking into account different perspectives. And that in no way means what Russia is doing is right, the war is horrific. But as Marija says, and as my colleagues on the panel has often also said, there are so many different perspectives that we have to take into account. I've been struggling with this question for my book, and I think we have to separate the idea that everybody should empathize and that there should be people within governments who should empathize. You need people at the heart of strategy who can understand what is really going on and how does that change the calculations and the decisions that are taking place right now in those countries and those regions that we do not like, we do not trust, we don't really know what they're doing. And that is more strategic empathy. That is not compassion, that's not care. It's the way in which empathy informs strategy and decision making. You don't necessarily then have to go to your public and say, let's just all have more empathy. That's naive. I think that is where it falls down. And it's actually quite callous, I think, to expect people undergoing bombardments and trauma and violence to ask them to empathize with the people doing that. But there may come a point once you get to reconciliation or resolution at some point in the future of any conflict, where you then need to start finding ways of building that understanding and building a certain sense of connection. And as I said, empathy is not agreement and it's not condoning behaviors. It's different to compassion. It doesn't have that same element, but it is a means especially of moving from this power over to power with, finding new ways to create solutions that are beneficial to more people.
Ebert would like to
I think it's not naive at all. I agree 100% with Marija that now there's a military engagement necessary. I'm also, having lived in Russia for 5 years, I'm also a big fan of tough sanctions. But we have in our own history experience which proves that empathy works. And this is the German-French relationship. I remember my grandfather, who was born 1905. I had when I was 13 years old, I had a friend from France who came to our family. We're still friends, and now we're old, but we're still good friends. And my grandfather said to me, "I'm so happy that about this friendship between you and your French friend, because when I was raised, the French were our hereditary enemies. That's what we learned in school. And we had a war, and we had the Second World War, and I'm quite often on panels with Ukrainian friends or from the Ukrainian culture sector, and always when I say culture has to play a role in reconciliation later, then they attack me and they say there's no reconciliation and so on. And I think, of course, this needs a long time. And I think it needs firstly the will of the politicians to create this empathy, like we had with Adenauer and de Gaulle, and I don't see Mr. Putin be able to do that, but we have to think in generations, yeah. So, and then you have to have programs, exchange of students, exchange of pupils, cultural programs that you do together, and so on and so on. And now France is our closest ally, and the societies are very much connected. So I think we have a proof that this works in our own history, yeah. And I think this makes me positive for the future, although right now we have a very difficult situation.
We have to stay optimistic, I think, otherwise we cannot survive. There is a question from the audience, Dania. There will be a microphone coming to you.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much. I want to ask you a bit, since you mentioned sanctions. And that you're a believer in this. I won't be able to, I don't understand the Russian-Ukrainian context of sanctions very well, but I know, for example, in my region, there were sanctions against Syria, for example. Yet with what we're seeing is that people, normal people, are the ones who are paying the price of these sanctions more than the regime. Actually, if anything, Assad regime is getting stronger, and it almost feels as if nothing happened. We're back to 360 degrees, full circle. So I want to understand your perspective on how effective sanctions can be, given that we have many examples. We have Iraq, we have Syria, we have Iran, Sudan. We already have many, many examples. But what I'm hearing from people, I have many friends who have Syrians who left Syria and are now living in London, for example, but their families are all back home. And they're telling me about how they're struggling to find medicine, etc. So really, while I'm sure anyone who's in the government, if they fall sick, they will find medicine all right. But the normal people are the ones who are really being punished here. So how can you, I want your thoughts, because you said you're a pro-sanctions, like why is that? And how can you balance between you're actually punishing the government, not the people?
Thank you.
I think this is a very important question, and in part I agree. I relate it to the situation now in Ukraine and Russia. I'm not going into, because what I experienced in Russia, that if you want to prevent somebody to do something that you don't want, you have to be able to build up a threat which the opposite side will believe that you are realizing. And this is what sanctions do. And if you look at these sanctions, the first thing, one of the first thing was to take in luxury yachts from Russian oligarchs, to freeze the bank accounts of oligarchs in the West, to so really sanctions which were directed to the people that are really responsible for what they do, for what's happening. And I think this was a very wise step. And of course, without these sanctions just going on like that, there would not be any change in the Russian attitude. Right now there is no change, but I'm optimistic that this will influence on the long term also the Russian government. And of course, on the other hand, we see that other countries use this channel to support Russia with things that were formerly supported by the West. But still, I think that the Putin regime was very much surprised how hard the West reacted. And I also believe that it affected the unity within this system in a way that how do I say, that the decisions that are made someday have to go to a negotiation. Yeah. Don't see that now, and I understand your respect, but I have an experience which tells me that the sanctions are the right way, and without them we would not go into any direction which is going to a resolution of the conflict.
Thank you. Since I don't see any questions from the audience, I would like to ask you, Tiziket, and go back to Taiwan for a second before we have to wrap up. In what ways does China try to influence public opinion in Taiwan? I mean, you have an organization, you deal with that. What do organizations like Double Think Lab do to counter these Chinese initiatives?
So what we do here in very short sentence is that we are trying to track down the state-funded cyber troop online, what lies or disinformation, what we call, or propaganda they are trying to spray or try to boost through those inauthentic coordination effort online. So one of the main topic or main things they are spreading right now, not only to Taiwan, but also other Chinese-speaking countries to Chinese diaspora, is the anti-West or anti-democracy value. So this skepticism sprayed inside the Taiwan especially is about whether U.S. is going to help defend Taiwan at all if the China is invaded. They try to reduce the trust among Taiwan people to other countries. So, and also to our own capability for our military defense. So I think generally before the Ukrainian war, I think that generally people here doesn't believe that we have any chance to defense if the invasion came, and we don't have trust to our military, and we don't have trust among our people or other countries. Some people just skeptical about Western country whether they will actually, help defense. But inspired by the Ukrainian, I think that lots of a new generation people are start thinking about the actual modern war, what it looks like and what we can actually do to defend ourselves. Or there's a huge group of the volunteer group for civil defense training are forming from young people. They try to teach people how to do EMT, how to rescue other people, how to do, evacuation, everything. So I guess we do generally learn a lot from what is happening in this side of the world, but also I think they try to prevent this like a trust issue to democracy or countries. It's really important right now. Actually, China is there's a survey last year. Actually, China is the only country that think the U.S. should be blamed for Ukrainian war. That by 52% of the Chinese population think the number one fault is the U.S. and the number second is NATO. And Ukraine and Russia is equally innocent. So I guess the problem is like linked to the last panel here is that their information source is only like very limited, right? So there's a very highly controlled information space. So censorship, everything. So if you get a lot of information, it's only talking about one side of the story, that is the U.S. is bad, they have evil agenda, or they do also have a human rights problem, then you get so many years and by this type of a narrative, and it's of course naturally they will think that whatever happened in Ukraine is the U.S. behind, right? So I'm just want to point it out is that we also think that this is urgent and also important, but it's also very difficult to think about how we provide more source of the information or different side of the stories to those people in different places.
Thank you very much. We have one last question. If you please keep it short, because really we just have another 3 minutes only. So the microphone is coming your way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have a very simple question. It's about promoting values, because we spoke a lot in the previous session about fact-checking, and this is like the first level, but the second level is to understand that this war in Ukraine, is a battle of values. It's a war of values, not only the battle for territories. And my question is about European Union. How well are we doing in winning the trust across borders? How well are we doing within European Union, like Hungary and Poland, and also outside European Union in parts of the world, like Africa, for example? What are we doing wrong?
Who is this?
Thank you. Well, it's to everyone who wants to take it.
Marija. Last word.
Okay. Well, first of all, of course, it's a question for another discussion, but I would say that, A, we are not doing enough to be understood in broader terms outside Europe, outside the West also, by people in countries that are even recipients of EU aid, but they don't quite buy our political agenda, and I think that the fault is also on our side. We have to be able to speak more clearly and better about our political agenda. That's one. And another, well, I think that inside Europe, of course, there is lack of unity on some issues. For example, fundamental rights. We see that in some countries there is homophobia, there are elements of racism. So, of course, we need to do our own homework, without doubt, and that's a never-ending process. I think we are coming up against some very tough cases. You mentioned Hungary, but it doesn't mean that we need to just say, okay, so we are different, so we'll just live with this difference. I think we cannot afford in the EU to ignore fundamental rights.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for. I'm sorry, Mr. Ebert. I know you were already taking your microphone, but there are still so many interesting panels ahead here at the Kultursymposium, and I have to be strict today with time. So thank you so much. As a matter of fact, the next talk will just start here in 5 minutes. So you can quickly grab a coffee and come back if you want, or go to the next. I say thank you so much to our speakers here on the panel, Claire Yorke, Marija Golubeva, Titi Cat, and Mr. Ebert, for being with us. Thank you so much for your time and for your questions. And at 12:30, Kevin Mwashiro will hold his talk about faith in Africa's youth on this stage. So if you like to stay, you're more than welcome. And otherwise, we'll see each other later. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you very much.